Why Myanmar is falling apart. This is Myanmar. On a map, it looks simple. One country, one territory, one government. But the moment you look beyond the map, that picture starts to fall apart. Across Myanmar, different armies control different territories. Ethnic armed organizations have fought the central government for generations. Resistance forces have emerged across the country. And in the middle of it all stands a military that has repeatedly seized political power and used force to maintain control. This is not a small conflict happening in one remote corner of the country. Myanmar is home to more than 50 million people, and millions have been forced from their homes as fighting has spread across the country. Cities have been attacked. Villages have been destroyed. Roads and airports have become part of the battlefield. And in some regions, the government in the capital has struggled to exercise meaningful control over territory that officially belongs to the same country. But Myanmar's crisis becomes even more complicated when you look at its borders. To the west is India and Bangladesh. To the north is China. To the east are Laos and Thailand. And to the south lies the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. Myanmar sits directly between some of Asia's most important powers and trade routes. For China, it offers a land route toward the Indian Ocean. For India, it sits beside one of its most sensitive frontier regions. And for Southeast Asia, instability in Myanmar creates problems that don't stop at the country's borders. Then there is something even stranger. In parts of Myanmar's borderlands, the collapse of central authority has helped create enormous criminal economies. Drug trafficking has expanded. Industrial-scale scam operations have appeared. And thousands of people have reportedly been trafficked into compounds where they are forced to work. So Myanmar isn't simply experiencing a civil war. It is dealing with several crises happening at the same time. A political crisis, an ethnic conflict, a territorial struggle, an economic collapse, a humanitarian disaster, and a growing geopolitical problem for the countries surrounding it. But here's the most important part of the story. Myanmar did not suddenly fall apart in 2021. The military coup of February 2021 was the moment the crisis exploded into a new phase. But the deeper problem is much older. When Myanmar became independent from Britain in 1948, it inherited a country made up of dozens of ethnic nationalities with different languages, religions, territories, and political ambitions. The new state had to answer a question that would haunt it for decades. Could all of these different peoples actually live under one political system? That question was never fully resolved. Instead, rebellions began. Armed organizations formed. The military became increasingly powerful. And in 1962, it seized power. Decades of military rule followed. There was eventually a democratic opening. There were elections. There was hope that Myanmar might finally escape its past. But the military never completely disappeared from politics. Then came the coup in 2021. And the country that had spent decades fighting wars around its borders suddenly entered a conflict that spread deep into its heartland. So how did Myanmar get here? How did a country with enormous natural resources, a strategic location, and a population of more than 50 million become trapped in one of the world's most complicated conflicts? And more importantly, is Myanmar actually falling apart, or is something even bigger happening to the country? To understand why Myanmar is falling apart today, we have to go back to the moment it became a country. For more than a century, Burma was under British colonial rule. But British Burma was never a simple, unified society. The central lowlands were dominated by the Bamar, the country's largest ethnic group. Beyond those lowlands were mountainous and border regions inhabited by many different ethnic nationalities, including the Shan, Karen, Kachin, Chin, Rakhine, and others. They had their own languages, cultures, religions, and political interests. And this diversity would become one of the defining challenges of the new country. During the struggle for independence, Burma's future leaders understood that keeping these different peoples together would require some form of political agreement. In 1947, Aung San and representatives of several major ethnic groups reached the Panglong Agreement, which promised a degree of equality and autonomy within a future union. For a moment, it looked like Burma might be able to build a country where different nationalities could share the same state without giving up their identities. But then, Aung San was assassinated. He never lived to see independence. And when Burma finally became independent from Britain on January 4, 1948, the new government inherited a problem that had not been fully solved. How much power should belong to the central government? How much should belong to the ethnic states? And who would guarantee that those promises of autonomy would actually be respected? Those questions quickly turned into armed rebellion. Several ethnic armed organizations emerged, demanding everything from greater autonomy to a federal system, and, in some cases, independence. The new government was suddenly fighting conflicts in different parts of the country. And this was the beginning of something that would define Myanmar for generations. A struggle over who should control the union, and what that union should actually look like. But there was another force watching all of this unfold. The military believed the country was becoming too divided to survive. And eventually, it decided that the only way to save Burma was to take control of it. The new government was already struggling to hold Burma together. But instead of finding a political solution, the country's most powerful institution began to believe that only the military could prevent the union from breaking apart. Then on March 2, 1962, General Ne Win seized power. The parliament was dissolved. The constitution was suspended. And Burma entered a new era of military rule. Ne Win called his system the Burmese way to socialism. In practice, it meant political power became concentrated in the hands of the military, while the economy was increasingly isolated from the outside world. Foreign businesses were pushed out. Trade was restricted, and Burma became one of Southeast Asia's most isolated countries. But isolation didn't solve the country's original problem. The ethnic conflicts continued. In the mountains and borderlands, armed organizations kept fighting the central government. And the military responded with increasingly aggressive campaigns to regain control. For ordinary people, decades of military rule brought political repression and economic hardship. Then in 1988, the country erupted. Mass protests spread across Burma, demanding an end to military rule. The military crushed the demonstrations, killing thousands according to widely cited estimates. A new military leadership took control. And in 1989, the country officially adopted the name Myanmar in English. But changing the country's name did not change its political reality. The military remained in power. Even when elections were held in 1990, the opposition National League for Democracy won overwhelmingly, but the military refused to hand over power. For another 2 decades, the country remained under military dominance. Yet eventually, something began to change. The generals started opening the country to limited political reform. A new constitution was introduced. Elections returned, and Myanmar began moving, slowly and cautiously, toward civilian government. For the first time in decades, it looked like the military might finally be willing to step back. But it never really gave up its grip on power. And that would become crucial, because the next chapter of Myanmar's history would create the illusion that the country was finally becoming a democracy. By the early 2010s, Myanmar appeared to be entering a new era. After decades of military rule, the government began introducing political and economic reforms. In 2011, a new semi-civilian government took office. Political prisoners were released. Restrictions on the media were eased. And Myanmar began reconnecting with the outside world. Then came 2015. The National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, won a decisive election victory. For many people, it looked like Myanmar had finally escaped military rule. But there was a problem hidden inside the country's new political system. The military had never completely surrendered its power. Under the 2008 Constitution, the armed forces were guaranteed 25% of parliamentary seats, enough to block constitutional changes, and the military retained control of key security ministries. So Myanmar had a civilian government, but the military still had enormous constitutional power. And then another crisis exposed how fragile this new democracy really was. In 2017, violence in Rakhine State forced hundreds of thousands of Rohingya to flee across the border into Bangladesh. The military faced widespread international condemnation, while Myanmar's democratic transition suffered a major blow. Yet the political system continued. In November 2020, Myanmar held another general election. The NLD won by a large margin. But the military disputed the election results, alleging widespread fraud. The dispute could have been resolved through the country's institutions. Instead, on February 1, 2021, before the new parliament could begin its term, the military seized power. Myanmar's experiment with democracy had collapsed. But this time, something was different. The public did not simply accept military rule. Millions took to the streets. Workers stopped working. Civil servants refused orders. And as the military crackdown intensified, a new resistance began to form. The country was about to enter a war unlike anything it had experienced in decades. The military expected the coup to restore its control. Instead, it helped create something it had never faced before. Across Myanmar, millions of people rejected the takeover. Doctors stopped working. Teachers walked away from their classrooms. Civil servants refused to cooperate with the new authorities. And peaceful demonstrations spread through cities across the country. But the military responded with force. As the crackdown intensified, many protesters realized that demonstrations alone might not be enough. Some left the cities. Some crossed into areas controlled by ethnic armed organizations. And some began training to fight. This was the moment a new generation of resistance fighters began to emerge. They eventually formed People's Defense Forces, or PDFs, while established ethnic armed organizations continued fighting the military in their own territories. And something important happened. The new resistance was no longer limited to Myanmar's traditional ethnic conflict zones. The war was moving into the heart of the country. For decades, Myanmar's military had fought ethnic armed groups mainly in the country's borderlands. Now, young people from the Bamar-majority heartland were joining an armed struggle against the same military. Different groups had different goals. Some wanted federal democracy. Some wanted greater autonomy. Others wanted to remove the military from political life completely. They didn't necessarily agree on what Myanmar should become. But they increasingly agreed on one thing. The military could no longer be allowed to control the country. By 2023, the conflict entered another major phase. An alliance of ethnic armed organizations launched Operation 1027, capturing military positions and large areas in northern Shan State. The offensive demonstrated something that had once seemed difficult to imagine. The military could lose territory on a significant scale. Fighting spread further. Military bases were attacked. Border towns changed hands. And the junta increasingly relied on airstrikes and artillery to compensate for its difficulties on the ground. The consequences were devastating. Millions of people were displaced. Businesses closed. Schools and hospitals were disrupted. Food and fuel became harder to access in many areas. And Myanmar's economy, already weakened by years of instability, suffered another enormous shock. But the most important change was not simply how much territory was being lost. It was who was now fighting. The old ethnic wars had merged with a new nationwide resistance. And Myanmar had entered a conflict where there was no longer one simple front line. And no obvious path to victory. The military still possessed aircraft, artillery, heavy weapons, and a powerful state apparatus. The resistance controlled or contested large areas and had built alliances with long-established ethnic armed organizations. Neither side could easily force the other to disappear. And that created a much bigger question. If the government cannot fully control the country, and the resistance cannot completely defeat the military, What happens to Myanmar next? Myanmar has now reached a point where winning the war may not be enough to solve the country's deeper problem. The military still controls the central institutions of the state. But across the country, ethnic armed organizations and resistance forces control or contest significant areas of territory. And the boundaries between these areas are constantly changing. There is no single front line. Instead, Myanmar has become a patchwork of different power centers. And geography makes the situation even more important. Myanmar sits between China, India, Bangladesh, Laos, and Thailand, with access to the Bay of Bengal. For China, Myanmar is particularly important. Oil and gas pipelines cross the country toward China's southwest. Myanmar also gives China access to the Indian Ocean, without relying entirely on routes through the Strait of Malacca. So Beijing has a reason to protect its interests. But it also has to deal with armed groups operating close to its border. That has made China's position extremely complicated. It has maintained relations with Myanmar's military, while also communicating with powerful ethnic armed organizations. Because for Beijing, stability matters more than choosing one side. And instability has created another problem. In parts of Myanmar's borderlands, weak government control has allowed enormous criminal economies to grow. Drug trafficking remains a major problem. And industrial-scale scam compounds have turned some border regions into centers of organized crime, with people from around the world being trafficked into forced labor. So the consequences of Myanmar's collapse are no longer limited to the battlefield. They cross borders, they reach neighboring countries, and they affect people thousands of miles away. But the greatest cost is being paid inside Myanmar itself. Millions have been displaced. Food insecurity has grown. Healthcare and education systems have been severely disrupted. And in 2025, a devastating earthquake struck central Myanmar, hitting a country that was already struggling to respond to a massive humanitarian crisis. The disaster added another layer of suffering to a population already exhausted by years of war. And despite the enormous pressure, the conflict has not simply ended. Myanmar's military has attempted to maintain control through force and political measures, including elections held during the 2025-26 period. But fighting and humanitarian suffering have continued. At the same time, neighboring countries and regional organizations have pushed for dialogue. The possibility of negotiations has created a small opening. But there is still no guarantee that Myanmar's opposing forces can agree on what should come after the war. And that may be the hardest problem of all. Because Myanmar's crisis was never only about who controls the government. It is about what kind of country Myanmar should become. A centralized state, a genuine federal union, greater autonomy for ethnic regions, or something entirely different. For more than 7 decades, Myanmar has never found an answer that everyone can accept. And until it does, even if the guns eventually become silent, the conflict may not truly be over. After more than 7 decades of conflict, Myanmar's future remains uncertain. The war may eventually change. Territories may change hands. Governments may change. But none of that guarantees that Myanmar's deeper problems will disappear. Because even after the fighting stops, the country will still have to decide how power is shared, how its different regions are governed, and what role the military should have in the future. That is why Myanmar's story is far from over. The question is no longer simply whether the country can survive another year of war. It's whether, after generations of conflict, Myanmar can finally find a way to live with itself. And perhaps that is the most important question of all. Because a country doesn't truly come together when the fighting stops. It comes together when people finally have a reason to stop fighting. This is Y-verse.